we're so many other things. We're not just this cute little, talking point, but real humans with serious issues.
Sarah, welcome to our first ever in-person episode here in New York City. It's such an honor to have you. And last time we were together in this space, it was our first time meeting in person.
Yes, it was.
We've been internet social media friends for the past couple of years, and it's just so wonderful to have you on the show.
Thank you so much for having me. I'm so happy to be able to talk to you today and just to keep in conversation about the many ways that we can change the world.
Absolutely. And something you and I both have in common is that we are passionate conversationalists. So without further ado, let's dive right in. Before we even get to your backstory, I want to start with a controversial question, which is, do you think migration is a human right?
I do, and I think that contrary to people's opinions and what they would assume we would be at change-wise, that's still not something that everyone thinks. And policy-wise, we have beyond a long way to go before addressing the injustices in immigration reform, and that migration is a global crisis that has gone on for centuries.
And my goal today is that our community really understands your point of view. So let's dive a little bit deeper. Why do you believe migration is a human right?
Well, to take it to my personal story, during high school, I realized the big gap in understanding and in knowledge and access that a lot of my friends had regardless of immigration status. More so because of your income status and level of resources that your community has, that's what determines the level of education that you get. And so on that note, I began to really take a look into what the consequences would be of not having these resources for us in high school would be in college. And so what I saw is a lot of us really would end up feeling like college wasn't for us because of our immigration status. But again, there was so much similarities in other low income students in my high school that I'm like, there are so much commonalities in the issues that we advocate for than we can really understand. And so I know immigration is a human right because everyone migrates for different reasons. And though every single country has different risk levels and political atmospheres, at the end of the day, people migrate because of climate change. People migrate because of disparities in economic equality and like education access, back to education. So there's just this whole world related to immigration that I feel like I even had to know to understand and approach advocating for immigration reform as a young undocumented person who was preparing to try to start college and to feel deserving of a space in America, in the place that I had began to call home at a very young age, regardless of anyone else's opinions.
Thank you so much for sharing that. And I know you just mentioned you came here at a very young age, and I love what you said about how people migrate for different reasons. I remember when I was reading more about your story, you've shared that your family migrated here from Costa Rica. You were 3 years old, right?
Yeah.
Why did your family decide to migrate?
So my mom, has health issues related to the heart. And so the access that the U.S. offered in surgeries and medical procedures for people that were born with heart issues wasn't the same in Costa Rica. Like it is for so many countries, access to the type of procedure that she needed wouldn't be available in Costa Rica for 10 years. And by then, it would mean the passing of my mom at that point. So my parents made the very risky decision of migrating and of understanding that they wouldn't have an understanding, right? There would be no plan. It would just be, we are going to America for better options in healthcare and better access to education for my sister and me. And so that was their main reason. Obviously, like many countries, it's known for its beauty, but there's a lot of poverty. And so my parents understood that by coming here for health access, they also improved the likelihood of certain access to education and opportunities for my sister and me. And that was our story.
Thank you so much for sharing that. It's so interesting to hear your point of view about why your family decided to come here, because to some extent it was life or death. It was your mom's health or otherwise. And so once you got here, what was the critical turning point that led you down this path of activism?
I think my whole life, because I feel like as immigrants, we live regular lives. We're not walking around with immigrant on our forehead like any other group does not either. Subconsciously, there's this internalizing of like, we come here for better opportunities, you know, this is not a chance to be wasted. And so though that all sounds like a lot of pressure, it also felt like a blessing to be able to show up in English for my parents and to be a translator at a young age in government offices and important rooms that were determining for my parents in those points. A culmination, I guess, of that was like getting to high school and realizing, wow, I wasn't ready for college and there was no one to blame. Like the only thing we could do was like blame the government. But like even then there was something to be done. And so it was at that point realizing that all of my life had led to me becoming this person that wanted to advocate and didn't want to just take care of my own career, but wanted to start asking really heavy questions to really important people in our government. And so I would say, to stamp a moment, it would be when I was 17 years old. I interviewed the president of Costa Rica, and interviewing him, I got to ask about DACA and the different immigration temporary statuses that exist that cover Costa Ricans and many other countries outside of Costa Rica. And so his answer was that he didn't know like what DACA was. And so being 17, like being so worried about college, I was like, a president doesn't know the answer to this? Like, I still feel mind blown, like if it was that moment yesterday, because we were taught so highly of institutions and governments. And so though they are what holds a lot of power, they're still human and it's possible they don't know certain things. And so that gave me back a lot of power from thinking that I wasn't worthy of stepping into certain rooms to realizing that like your worth is not in what you know or don't know. But at that moment, I felt leverage. I'm like, I don't know what this is, but he doesn't know what DACA is. And he was asking questions, and that gave me the opportunity to educate a government official and say,
What did you say? What did you say to him?
I said, well, DACA is Deferred Action for Childhood Arrivals, and it was put in place 2 years ago, Mr. President. And a lot of Costa Ricans are affected by this, as are Central Americans alike in countries outside of Latino / Hispanic descent countries. And he was super open. He said, well, I don't know, but it seems you do, and I'll put you in touch with my team. And like, there was a program I was working on developing. So I got the opportunity to work on that, like fresh out of high school. I think it's moments like that that I feel like inspired me to keep going, because I realized like there's just so much room to never take no for an answer and to like be a solution bringer.
Absolutely.
Just made it my word, like to places that like might seem so scary. Like you might be the person that has a solution for that, as silly as your solution might sound.
Absolutely. And I find that when we're discussing any topic that seems to be controversial or taboo, a lot of times I find that people don't know how to talk about those issues because they don't know enough about them. After you found your voice and you were willing to go out and take a chance and be someone who was willing to share their story on a public stage, what was that moment like? How did you know you were ready to go out and use your story to transform the world?
Well, that moment really did change my life. I just have to say that, because it really took a lot to think, like, just even to just do it. I'm like, oh my gosh, am I doing the right thing right now? But I think that was the moment for me, because it was right after high school. I saw so many friends that were undocumented. And again, even those that were born here, but just that didn't have the same college prep as other people, struggle to prepare for a real adult world. And like, I think at that moment, I just knew that was a question that needed to be asked. And I didn't know if my question would result in anything, but I knew it wouldn't not result in anything. You know what I mean? And like, basically I took that opportunity to say also conversations are important, right? Like that conversation might have seemed simple to somebody else, but that's something that maybe somebody else would have felt too afraid to ask because of their own status, or because it is just might seem taboo to the president of a country. But I felt like that moment was important for me because I had always been great at conversation. So I was like, I don't have A+, I don't have the best history in high school with my grades, but I knew that I was good at bringing people together in high school and like being somebody who like pushed others to ask for help. So like, because I learned to, I felt that was a question that everybody else might have gotten benefit from. I also decided at that moment to use that piece of content to launch the Internet Recycler, because I felt like interviews like that were conversations that would determine how somebody else would feel about themselves at a different moment or in that moment in time. And all of it didn't feel like it was the perfect moment, but it just felt like there wasn't another moment either. Like that, though there was fear and there were so many questions, that was the moment where I needed to not only share my story, but like use my story to ask a question, and only putting myself really at risk, but making sure others saw that they were seen through these very difficult conversations.
Absolutely. You are a unifier yourself, and I really admire how you utilize your platform and even your story every day to bring people together to share theirs. But I want to take a moment. I know you had a very interesting coming out story when you shared with the world that you are undocumented. What was that like, sharing that and coming out to the world?
Yeah, so I mean, I shared that I was undocumented at the interview with the president of Costa Rica unofficially because I didn't say I'm undocumented, but I did say I have DACA, and so DACA equates to temporary status. But then there was also a moment in 2017, a year after President Trump's election. I feel like for the immigrant community, for so many people, it just meant the same thing: repetitive frustration and being used by elected officials to push out new candidacy. But I think for me, as somebody who was like pushing to get through college and looking for opportunities and resources for undocumented students, it just meant the end of college for me. And so I stopped college because, one, affording it and getting financial aid wasn't a reality at that moment, though now about 8 states have passed financial aid for undocumented students. But also because I felt like we were a new generation. Like there had already been so many generations fighting for immigration reform, but here we are, the new generation that has access to social media, the microphone that never shuts off. And so to the initiative that I launched, I said, I'm reactivating the Internet Recycler and I'm just gonna blast my story. And in doing that, I was working with a local org, and I was actually the first undocumented person they hired. And I started to realize, again, my story was being pulled left and right for articles, for interviews with certain candidates. And the governor of New Jersey was up for re-election, and he was the candidate that for the first time in I think 2 different governors was pushing for immigration reform. And I was asked to like lead certain press conferences, and I kind of questioned myself doing it or not, because I realized like this is another candidate, right? We are still talking about candidacies and potential and not about actual tangible policy changes. But I realized it was a risk I was willing to take again because it was my story, and I wasn't going to allow for anyone to position me as a dreamer, which is a word that is detested a lot by our community because it's like, we're so many other things. We're not just this cute little, talking point, but real humans with serious issues. I was invited to lead the Pledge of Allegiance for the opening of his election because he got elected. After sharing my story as undocumented during his running for office, like it was official, like people knew I was undocumented. It had been blasted all over the state of New Jersey. And then I was elected president of a national movement with youth. And so I definitely came out as undocumented there. And so sharing it, I feel like I created such a big community around like people also wanting to take action with their own story, and the power of reclaiming your story as whatever you are seen to be. And it was all really overwhelming.
What is so powerful about what you've done, Sara, is you have paved a path for other people to not only share their story, but to reclaim it. Mm-hmm. And I think it's fascinating hearing you talk about how to some extent you were tokenized. Mm-hmm. You were sharing your story so vulnerably and openly, but it almost put you into a box.
Right.
And I know that today, you've even told me this, like you are so much more than just an activist or your own story. You're a lover of fashion,
right.
You're a student getting another degree. Like you have so many things going for you. How have you been able to break the mold of what people think you should be versus celebrating all of the parts of you?
I think to the same thing, like trying to show up as myself every time, like even if I feel like, oh, because I created a platform, or like because I have this, I should be doing that, leaving room for myself to decide. And that's why I like to do things like share when I do my makeup, or like share what kind of clothes I really like to wear, or share myself at the gym, because I think people come to an understanding of who you are by the first face they see, because that's the internet. But I think all of what happened and what I did in the moment was because of the very serious emotions and like things that were happening in politics for the immigrant community. That doesn't take away what my like passions are outside of who I am. So I think making room and like intentionally showing up for the things I love, and just being like, I don't know how else to say, but like being myself is the best way I've made room to not be boxed in, because I've realized that being yourself is actually pretty hard when you're expected to carry yourself a certain way. And like, it is hard to be yourself. At the end of the day, you still feel the pressure to, maybe I should have been doing this by now, or maybe I should have been doing that. But one thing I know is I wasn't supposed to dream this big, and I wasn't supposed to like be okay with sharing my story and like then telling others to be okay. Like, You know what I mean?
Being yourself is way easier said than done sometimes.
Exactly.
I know I've experienced that too. Have you ever wrestled with self-doubt? And as someone who is undocumented, have you ever been made to feel less than?
Of course. I mean, I think everyone wrestles with self-doubt regardless of immigration status. And less than, I think, because in certain rooms I have realized, like, well, naturally, where I grew up, the city I grew up in, the access maybe I had, didn't leave room to prepare for college as much. But if anything, I've realized that the spaces I grew up in, I claimed a lot as like home. And so, like, more times than others, I've found that the people I've been around and doing the work that I'm doing don't make me feel less than. So I don't really, I guess, leave room for anyone that does make me feel less than, because I think when you operate from a place of abundance, you realize that, like, there is no less than, right? And there's no one. And though there is in policy and in very real spaces, I think I don't allow myself to fall into spaces like that. And when I do, I work to surround myself with, people who can remind me that, like, that's just not how you have to think about yourself.
For so many young people who are hopefully going to be listening to our conversation today, I think there's a stereotype, which is that in order to have a voice, you have to start your own platform.
Yeah.
You have to be the leader of a movement. You have to be the loudest person in the room. And I want to double tap on something that you said, which is even being yourself and being brave enough to share your story is using your voice. So what would you say to someone out there who maybe is struggling with hustle culture or feeling like they need to do it all in order to have a voice?
Well, number one, you have a voice, period. You do not have a voice. That's just not how it works. And though the world we're in right now makes it seem like that, you do have a voice. And then also number two, like, if you just stop for a moment and don't think about what anybody else is doing, like, you know what the things that you like to do. So I feel like it's important for others to share this message and say, like, never look over your shoulder to see what somebody else is doing, because no one can ever walk in somebody else's shoes the same way. We are our own individual people, no matter how much we resemble each other. So, like, understand what are the things that you really love to do, because from a base, you're gonna technically do what you love, whether you like it or not, because that's what you're naturally gonna be inclined to do. There's things you're gonna have to experience that aren't necessarily your ideal, because that's life. That's gonna be testing out the waters and seeing what are some of the things you like, and definitely leave room to also live your, like, life too, and have, like, a social life outside of work, because I think with hustle culture, something that is not said in telling you to follow your dreams is that, like, life and time is golden, and, like, the time that you could live with yourself and others is, like, not replaceable. So there's always room to work. And so don't ever let that, but make sure you are giving yourself the room to also live outside of work. I wish more successful people said that, like, and I think they do now, because we have social media and you hear them, like, that's just important too, like, your health as well, like,
Yeah.
whew.
Absolutely. I love what you said. And
Yeah.
I have to also shout you out for a moment, because I think in so many ways, Sara, you've redefined what it means to have a voice. For people who are watching this, they don't know that you aren't even allowed to vote in this country, yet you've influenced legislation and political policy. You've created your own chair at a table in spaces like the UN and all of these places that traditionally young people are excluded from. So tell us a little bit more about that. What was it like to be at the forefront of influencing policy and legislation while also at the same time not having the right to vote?
Really getting into elections, 2017 was the year for me, because there was just so much conversation locally and nationally, not only on local elections, but on national elections. We had so much at stake at who was going to be the next president, who was going to be in Senate and Congress. And I think I still felt like in those spaces, immigrants and our community of immigration related topics were addressed as, like, again, a talking point, and we weren't the talkers. And so, I mean, it wasn't new because I started talking about it. It was just the new approach of using social media to share our opinions. So I got to, give my opinion for a CNN piece, and people were just blasting their comments saying, well, like, we're going to deport you for talking about this. And, like, I'm laughing right now, not because it's funny, because I think I laugh at how ironic everything is. Like, even just having an opinion and telling others to go out to vote made people want to say they were going to deport me. So it just showed me this doesn't make sense. Like, we're not going to talk because people are terrified of our opinion, because though that sounds contradictory, if there's a billion people talking, what are you going to do? You're going to deport all billion people. How are you going to check the... So not to get into that, but it was just this... I think I was in such an angry space when I started sharing my opinion on voting, because I wasn't telling you who to vote for. I was literally just saying go out to vote, and people were still so angry. So it showed me, like, this is not about my status. This is you. You have a problem with, like, change, and, like, things have to change whether you like it or not. And so getting to encourage people to believe in the power of change fueled me through elections, because it showed me, well, you're scared of change. You're not scared of a status. Well, you're scared of change, and maybe you are scared of a status. And so I pushed through midterm elections like that, and creating so many campaigns around the importance of something like voting, because I was like, this is one action, right? There are so many other actions. Likely everyone's going to have the same opinion if you encourage something else in change outside of elections. So I pushed with that energy because of that, because I think we're not used to media. We're not used to the power of having 100,000 opinions, and, like, it's just not going to go away. So I realized that regardless of my status, me telling somebody to vote is powerful, because I didn't feel limited by that, though so many did. I just felt like I was another person that was probably advocating more for change than somebody who was a citizen.
It's really remarkable hearing how you've challenged and reflected on all of the different voices that have come at you over time. I think what you just shared really double taps on our mission here at POVz, which is to actually sit with and understand different viewpoints. So I'd love to know, Sara, are you able to have conversations with people who have a different view than you do when it comes to immigration?
Yeah, absolutely.
And how have you been able to navigate those conversations? I know at the beginning of our talk today, I asked you, is migration a human right? And you said yes. Tell me about what it's been like talking to people who believe the opposite as you and do not believe migration as a human right.
I mean, it's always intense, because I think, like, when you touch on anything that's related to policy, or when you touch on somebody's patriotism, like, I feel like people stick really hard either for there is no America, or I believe America is the best country in the world. And sometimes that you don't hear about the in-between, people who are like, you know what I mean? Yes and no, there's the good and the bad. So I feel like I'm able to, I just do. And then I try to listen my best that I can. I'm not saying everything I say is right, but I do think that it is important to have those conversations, and I do. And again, I listen through. Change happens when you're able to have conversation. So I just do. It's overwhelming. I think some people are more kind than others in the way they're able to have a conversation. And then I think if you're the calm one, then naturally the other person might feel a blasting green light to go off. I'm like, go off. That's not going to change, like, you know what I mean, how I stand for what I stand for. But I think they have to happen. Even though I'm working in media in immigration reform, because I'm focused more on, like, strategy around the spaces that I'm working around, I haven't come across it as much lately. But when I do, I feel like I'm just going to always have the same reaction. Ready to talk, ready to explain things that maybe other people might not understand perspective-wise, and ready to listen. I think as long as you're always willing to have a conversation or learn something new, the worst a conversation could go is bad. Then that's it. The conversation ends, hopefully.
Love that. I love what you said about how conversations have to happen.
Yeah.
And I think it's so important that we don't avoid them. And you mentioned, even as you were explaining your perspective just now, that sometimes people will say, you know, America is the greatest country in the world. I'd love to ask you that question too, having come to America and having your family migrate here. Do you feel like America has afforded your family the opportunities that a lot of people are told exist when they come to America?
Yeah, I mean, I think, again, coming from countries where, like, there is either extreme poverty or there is a completely different political background, what I argue is that there is a ridiculous standard and picture of what America is going to be. It's definitely a country that provides completely different access than other countries. That patriotism should never be sold to any human being. Like, a nation is a nation and a government's a government, and, like, there should still be, in an ideal world, an equal or leveled out conversation between the citizens of a nation or the people of a nation and the leaders versus like a praise. And I think seeing now as I got older, when people migrate, like depending on the country you're migrating from, you're migrating with this like insane idea of what a country's supposed to be that I just don't think plays out right, because then people could end up like not seeing their own value as human beings that are working and contributing to a society. But I definitely think at the end of the day, my mom did get like open heart surgery in America. And like, I feel like a person that moves and like lives a life of somebody who, you know what I mean, is a respectful person and citizen in the country. But yeah.
Absolutely. And where you are now, when asked the question, is the American dream still alive and well today? How do you respond?
Yeah. I mean, I feel like the American dream is an immigrant related term. And like, I migrated when I was 3. So I don't know if that's my place to answer anymore. Like, you know what I mean? I feel like I want to give myself the room to say I don't know, because I don't. Like, there's so much to unpack.
Totally. And I respect that. I think there's a lot of emphasis nowadays for us to feel like we know it all. And
Yeah.
I really respect that you were like, hey, this is complex. Maybe I don't have all the answers, but that's my own experience. So thank you for sharing.
Yeah.
And when you zoom out, thinking about your activism, when you're organizing and you're at rallies, do you feel like you're able to entertain people who are also advocating on the other side of the issue? Have you had a sit down with someone who maybe is advocating against what you're advocating for?
Yeah, I mean, I don't think I've had to sit down, like intentionally set up a coffee time to like have a conversation with people that are opposing immigration reform, but I think it's intentional. I think like the system entirely opposes immigration reform, and I don't mean to just like jump into getting general, but like in my workspace is to uplift the work of what people are doing locally, because it is not acknowledged in when it comes to elections. There are spaces that determine the safety, education, and livelihood of immigrant communities. And so in my work, there has been so much room to not only have conversation, but essentially green light and okay like discrimination and racism, because you have to. You're in a workplace where people blatantly are like, well, you have DACA, like I don't even know why you're here. You know what I mean? In like passive aggressive ways that I think for me, it became something where I'm like, okay, well, no is not an option for immigration reform. I'm going to work to uplift the voices of the work that's already happening. But I have come across conversations like that. I haven't situated myself or felt like I've ever been in such a safe space to even position myself to have opposing conversations like that. I think to even do that, you have to be okay in so many other places. And for me, a lot of it has been survival mode. So I'm like, I don't think anybody in survival mode should be trying to find somebody that opposes immigration reform, because that's going to be super re-traumatizing and just off completely.
Yeah, I hear you.
Yeah.
I hear you. And for anyone in our community who maybe does oppose certain elements of immigration reform or who stands on the side of the issue that migration is not a human right, leaving today, what do you want that person to know about your point of view and what you know to be true and what you believe about immigration?
That it's complicated to explain, that like anybody else's life, let's say we weren't talking about a status, nobody understands your family like you do. Like no one understands your upbringing like you do. I invite those who maybe completely hate immigrants or who completely hate the idea of immigration reform to just like look into a little bit of the work that exists already. I think that we could all live a little better if we were a little more okay with not being scared of people that didn't necessarily like look like us or like live the same life as us. And I'm always open to talking. I think, again, I haven't intentionally set up time to do that because it's been all really overwhelming and it's all happened over the span of a short amount of time and it's been super intense, but I'm never close to it. I think if I could ever answer questions on places people could go to help or ways, books, things they can search up to like educate themselves, I'll make a little care package online and send it over for people to like take action, because things aren't hopeless. There's always something we could do.
And thank you for sharing that everyone's experience is individual.
Yeah.
Right? I think we
Exactly.
oftentimes think of the collective before individual experiences. And I think what I'm definitely taking away from our conversation is how powerful your individual story is.
Right.
And there's always more to learn from the experiences of others.
Exactly.
So thank you.
Thank you.
So Sarah, we're going to head over to our next segment now where we're going to introduce different POVs from our larger Gen Z community. So keep an eye on your phone. We're going to send you some texts. And when you get one, I want you to read it out loud and react accordingly.
Okay.
Sound good?
Sounds good.
Let's do it.
When it comes to the conversation around immigration, I only think undocumented immigrants should have a voice, since they are the ones who are oppressed.
So what do you think? Do you think people who are undocumented should be the only ones who have a say and a voice in immigration?
Well, I think naturally, like any other issue, if you were to think about any other cause that way, you would agree. So yes, like if you're the person that's majority impacted by immigration reform, you are the one who's experiencing what it feels like. So in my case, I have DACA. I know what it's like to have DACA. You know what I mean? Like I'm living with it every day. Doesn't make me the spokesperson of DACA, but it does make me an individual who is impacted by the lack of immigration reform and by having to overcome what the a day in the life is. So I would agree. I think inevitably others will support and exist in spaces, even if they are not necessarily impacted by immigration reform. But I think in this point, the point that's being made is that undocumented immigrants should lead in what is detrimental for undocumented immigrants, which is why we have people taking action and becoming the leaders of spaces, right? Whilst being undocumented, whilst having temporary statuses. So yeah, I would agree. There's still people who are citizens who work in like immigration reform orgs or like spaces that push for immigration.
So people who are undocumented and those who support.
Those who support, right? But then like, let's say there's an initiative, right, that's about to determine, what does scholarship access mean to students for a certain campus? I would hope there's undocumented students leading that to some extent, right? Because then, I'm glad that there's a resource. That would be my personal opinion. But I think there's always better to leave room for folks that are impacted to lead versus being spoken for. Because I think even in my work, I always emphasize, like, I'm one out of millions of undocumented immigrants. I'm not the immigrant, right? And so I say that and I see others say that because we believe we are not only immigrants when we go to these spaces. We're sharing, like you said, the other things that we are, passionate about, but we are leading in this space. But it is so much more different to be leading or to be pushing for change when you are impacted versus when you're just like an opinion from a second opinion, right? But everyone is needed. So that doesn't mean, you're discouraging for people to go into change for that. It just means you would hope for people to not be spoken for when people have their voice and are now more aware than ever that because their immigration status is not a citizen doesn't mean they don't have rights like before. Where before people really thought that. And now slowly but surely people are coming out of the shadows and realizing, whoa, like I have room to be a student. I have room to be a professional. I have room to have a dream. And like, I don't have to be silent. So yeah. People are only activists because it's a trend. It's all performative and social media activism doesn't create real change. To be honest, I think people only become activists so they can get famous.
That's a bit of a hot take. What do you think?
I have always agreed to some extent. And like, even when I got a platform, I was like, oh, heck no. I just became the irony of the irony because I would always say that. And like, even like when I first got verified, I'm like, what in the heck? Like being in some spaces, I would talk to spaces that led access in corporate world for activism, just say like, you're not about equality. Like you're literally equality company. And like, what the heck? So I think it's really frustrating because for people who are working on the ground, friends that I have that full-time don't work in media, like doing work that is strictly organizing, that absolutely hate the idea of sharing their story. Like, I think it's a lot to process. I think since I work in media, I probably don't have the clearest opinion of it. But like when I first started and I would see me and friends from this state and many states sharing their story, that's all I would think. I would say, wow, our stories are being exploited for candidates running for office, for new funding needed for orgs. And so it's not the truth. It's super trendy and everybody wants to be it because that's the hot take. And so like, even on my platform now, I think for me, that's why it's so important when I'm doing the work that people understand, like what you're going into is not fancy. Like you might take pictures as much as you want, but the real work of human rights is 100 different things outside of media too. Media is just one of the tools used that really like is most trending now, but like the organizing that happened for change and anything in the past in our history books, didn't happen with a camera, like, right? I still love media. I love the power of storytelling. I love the power of just breaking out voices that were not meant to be in certain spaces. But I would leave room to just agree and say, like, I think all of us have, you know, a lot of learning and learning to do to know how to move through being helpful or being of disservice.
No, thank you for sharing. It's interesting hearing about how that even impacted your POV on becoming someone who is a social media influencer and an activist, and being able to detect when someone is really pushing for change versus something performative. So thank you for sharing that POV.
Yeah. I believe that only documented US citizens should be able to vote, since they are actual United States citizens. Elections affect everyone. If they didn't, they wouldn't charge undocumented immigrants taxes. Like, you know what I mean? Like, if, and I think it's overwhelming to answer the question because there's so many answers that I should say right and correctly that I think it makes me not want to answer out of fear of answering wrong. But all in all, if it wasn't an undocumented immigrant issue, we wouldn't be acknowledged like citizens in so many other ways, right? There is a piece of history that I cannot state correctly, but there was a point in time where elections were also not accessible for another population of people. And so repetitively, elections and who is in power is left out of the hands of the majority of the people who are most impacted by wage abuse and like lack of education access naturally. So it just makes sense. I'm smiling because it's just ironic, the ignorance, right? Like, if there is so much inequality, of course the majority is going to be left out of the one thing that determines who's in power, and that's just not how it should be.
I hear you. Thinking about voting, when it comes to voting, do you think everyone should be able to vote?
I mean, I think there should be some kind of format, right? But I think just off the top of my head, people who are, you know, within the country and who have existed within the government, you know, for a long time should, because you now form part of the society. I'm not talking about people who are coming here to be a tourist or like, or just visiting the beauty of the US, but like people who are significantly and relevantly here in time have become part of the melting pot that is the US, as much as I hate to use that.
Yeah, and what would you say to people who think that only certain types of people in the US should be able to vote? For example,
I don't know. I would just want to meet them and get to know their story, and maybe they want their story to be heard. Like, what's up? Like, let's really, because it's like, I want to just say, OMG, I'm so mad at you. You need to change your opinion. But it's like, come on. Like, you know what I mean? If you go, you hear of so many people who buy a property, let's say in Costa Rica. So like, then you live there. But like, you don't live there because maybe you go back to the US and you work or wherever else you live. Well, you're technically now living there. You're going to have an opinion to some extent of a country that you're living in. I think it's just a little senseless to expect migration that happens naturally and as a crisis in many contexts, or lack of access, to not then impact the way you treat the people who migrate. It's just inevitable, like, logic. If people are migrating and have always been, this is not a new issue. We're going to have to find a logical solution for the way that we acknowledge individuals who, unless you shut down and make this country like completely impossible to get into, people are migrating and companies are benefiting, like people are benefiting. There is very much not a one-way relationship. It's a two-way street, and it's pretty clear. So it's going to have a solution eventually, including in elections.
Thank you so much for sharing that.
Thank you for listening.
My last question for you today, Sara, I'm so grateful you came on POVz. Clearly, my POV in all of this is that hearing stories and understanding other people's viewpoints is our way to come back together and to unify the world. So before you go, I have to know, what does unifying the world mean to you? Unifying the world to me means restoring hope, like restoring the belief that we can change the world regardless of the age, story that you come from. For me, unifying the world doesn't necessarily mean you're going to have everyone in the same headspace, but if I could help influence people that have nothing to do with me, that would have never met me otherwise, if I could influence their opinion about the ability to change the world and the ability for them to believe that they have a purpose, to me, that's unifying the world, because it is a mindset that I've been able to learn through my story of being a young undocumented person who has so many passions. But that is, I feel like, the motto for me, like helping people see their purpose regardless of their story. I'm not talking about only my immigrant community or immigrants in general, but just anyone.
helping restore their belief in their purpose and hope and our ability to change things as we see them. Because as idealists or as like super golly jolly happy as it sounds, that's the truth. You can change anything that you see, no matter how messed up it looks.
I love that answer, and I have no doubt that by sharing your story today here on POVz, we're one step closer to building that unified world. So thank you so much for being here, Sarah.
Thank you, Sophie.
I love everything you do and just honored to know you.
Thank you. You are awesome.